Hello and welcome to our talks on Becoming a Sage. Becoming a Sage is a series of 7 books. These books contain timeless titles loved among young and old alike. The books have been drawn from Confucianism, Taoism and Buddhism, the 3 main traditions of Chinese philosophy. What's so special about these books? Why are we looking at these books now? It's been internationally recognized that education is not only about learning to read and write, it's about values. It's about reaching one's full potential as a human being. And all of the books in this series are textbooks specifically designed with the goal of human excellence in mind. They're geared towards developing intellectual and moral virtues that further the learner towards a full, decent and dignified human life. These texts are tailored to the needs of young minds. They're short and concise. They use accessible language along with rhyme and rhythm, which makes the whole learning experience enjoyable, meaningful and memorable. So it is no wonder that they've been read so widely throughout East Asia and for so long. In fact, the 1,000-character classic in Volume 1 has a heritage of about 1,500 years. Today, at a time when parents and educators around the world are forging new forms of cultural literacy, educating learners about cultural diversity and sustainable development, and empowering learners to build a more secure, peaceful and harmonious world, the Becoming a Sage books add to our toolbox. As we will see, these books help young learners to develop the cognitive and socio-emotional skills like creativity, empathy, compassion, humility, and sense of responsibility that will prepare them for life and work. Beyond acquiring knowledge and skills, the Becoming a Sage books were written to instill a commitment to treat people with humanity, to abide by the rule of law, to be generous and caring to our neighbours, to respect human dignity while making the most of diversity. As these books have so much to offer the educational endeavour towards the art of living and improving quality of life, my colleagues and I are delighted to share with you what we've learned over the years. These talks would not have been possible without the support of so many, and we are particularly indebted to Venerable Master Chin Kung, the Academy of Sinology, our parents and our many teachers in mainland China, Hong Kong, Taiwan and the United Kingdom. Let's start with the very first title in Becoming a Sage. It's called in Chinese 小儿语, which in English has been translated as In the Words of Children. This text was written about 500 years ago in China's Ming Dynasty, and it belongs to the Confucian tradition. So by way of background, before we start reading the text, let's first briefly explain about the Confucian tradition, its ideas about learning and education, and how this text fits into the scheme of things. So what is Confucian tradition? For the short answer, Confucianism is a system of thought first articulated by Confucius, a Chinese philosopher of the 5th century before the Common Era, and the term Confucianism is based on his name. But this leaves us none the wiser. Who was Confucius? What are his ideas? His ideas, as we may know, have influenced East Asian culture for over 2,000 years. Ideas that continue to be studied in schools and universities around the world. First and foremost, Confucianism is a learning, a very pragmatic, practical learning, in the fine tradition of Chinese philosophy. In the words of Harvard University's Professor Michael Pewitt, he said, Chinese philosophy is very down to earth. It's about how I can become a better person, how I can relate to those around me better, how I can live a better life. As they say, no man is an island. Since the beginning of time, we human beings exist in a social web of interpersonal relationships. Within the family, we have parents and children, brothers and sisters, as well as extended family members. Beyond the family, we have friends, colleagues in the workplace, and fellow citizens in the community. Everyone is an individual, of course, but the point is we don't exist alone. As young people, we are sons or daughters. We are grandchildren, nephews or nieces. We are cousins, classmates and friends. We're also citizens of this planet. As we grow older, we may become employees, teachers, leaders, parents, and maybe even grandparents one day. So we exist in a social web of relationships, and learning in Confucian terms is learning to grow and flourish within those various roles. We learn to be someone who is sensitive to all the roles and relationships that make each one of us persons in our family and community. As Harvard University's Professor Du Weiming explains, Confucianism is a humanistic education that provides a comprehensive and integrated vision of the human condition. In a nutshell, we could say Confucian learning is learning to live a fulfilling life. A person who's perfected their Confucian learning and practice is known as a sage. Confucius is recognized as the utmost sage, and so Confucian learning is about becoming a sage. But Confucius was not the first sage. He saw himself as the defender of a long-established lineage. He said he was a transmitter and not a creator, that he delighted in and trusted the ancients. Confucius formalized and articulated a system of thought from the sages before him, sage rulers who had brought about periods of peace and stability in earlier times. Confucius not only taught and lived out the teachings, but he is traditionally thought to have also edited writings based on the ancient sage teachings. These writings later became known as the Five Classics, a canon of texts associated with Confucian learning. And Confucian learning actually became the official formal education in China from the year 136 before the Common Era. This meant, for example, that to become a government official, to be employed within the public service, one had to be trained and examined based on the Confucian curriculum. This continued until the early 20th century. Generations of scholars, thinkers, public officials, and people in East Asia developed and followed these teachings. So this explains how Confucian education became such a significant part of East Asian culture. So where do we start in this Confucian learning? The Five Classics combined amount to nearly 500,000 Chinese characters. So youngsters would start with shorter texts, and these texts were known as primers. Not only did these primers help develop their literacy, but they also introduced learners to the Confucian principles. The primers would extract elements from the great classics that the children could understand and practice. For example, elements related to physical and mental well-being, interpersonal skills, and a healthy outlook to life. The content would be typically structured in rhyme and rhythm, which not only made it easier to remember, but also fun to learn. The Becoming a Sage series contains many primers. Let's have a look at the first primer, In the Words of Children. This primer was written by the Confucian scholar Lu Desheng in the early 16th century. Lu Desheng chose to write in the format of a nursery rhyme with simple, everyday colloquial language. Now, why did he choose to write like this? In his preface, the author explained that as young children start learning to speak, they often learn nursery rhymes. Children enjoy learning and singing the nursery rhymes which have been passed down for generations. This has been happening for so long that no one knows exactly who composed them in the first place. Like many children around the world today, young children in traditional China grew up to the sounds of nursery rhymes. For example, we might remember singing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star or Mary Had a Little Lamb. The author, Lu Desheng, cared very much about the early childhood education. He thought that the existing nursery rhymes were certainly catchy and fun, but they weren't very meaningful. They weren't educational. So what did he do? Lu Desheng decided to write his own nursery rhyme, with tips on how to fulfill our innate potential from the great classics. What stands out about this particular text is that the author adopted the established nursery rhyme format, which is already familiar to young children. He uses simple colloquial language, which makes it easier for them to understand. And in the Chinese version, the phrases rhyme, which also makes the text easier to learn. For example, take the fourth line on the first page, counting from right to left. We'll read the Chinese first, and you can just listen out for the rhyme. 能有几句，见人胡讲，红中无声，满屏不响. Notice that the 讲 rhymes with 响. In English, the line has been translated as knowing a little and showing off. A large bell keeps silent, a full bottle makes no noise. By using a familiar format and a language that is simple, easy to understand, and easy to learn, the author Lu Desheng composed a nursery rhyme that was just as educational as it was enjoyable. About 200 years after this text was written, the renowned official Chen Hongmo wrote a commentary on In the Words of Children. Chen Hongmo, who we see depicted here on the left, has been described as the most influential Chinese official of the 18th century. He also cared very much about education. Throughout his career, he established many schools for the poor and disadvantaged to have access to formal education, and he often took the time to personally teach at those schools. Writing about In the Words of Children, Chen Hongmo starts by referring to Confucius, who praised a nursery rhyme and encouraged his students to take notice of the wisdom in its words. An English translation of that nursery rhyme goes like this. When the waters of the Canglang are clear, Canglang being the name of a river, I can wash my cap strings. When the waters of the Canglang are muddy, I can wash my feet. Confucius said, listen to this. When it is clear, it washes cap strings. When it is muddy, it washes the feet. This is all determined by the water itself. A person lacks self-respect, only then will others demean them. A family must ruin itself, only then will others destroy it. So even though it was just a children's rhyme, it was really quite meaningful. Chen Hongmo points out that, like the Canglang nursery rhyme, In the Words of Children was written as a nursery rhyme to help young learners understand some of the truths of life. Sometimes the tone is humorous, sometimes it's advisory, and sometimes it's instructive. To children, the Chinese original sounds no different from many other nursery rhyme, but they can benefit from its content because it includes so many things that one ought to know. Even though the child might not understand the full meaning of the text when they first read it, the wisdom in the words will become clear as they grow up. When we read In the Words of Children, we will see that it offers inspiration for both young and old. Take, for example, another line. On page 3, the third to last line, counting from the right. Peddlers and rickshaw drivers are the working poor. As they earn but a pittance, don't ask for more. From this passage, we can get a sense of the principles for having the right attitude in going about our daily life. Chen Hongmo wrote that once students become familiar with a text, they'll realize the depths of its meaning later on, and the text is by no means limited to a younger audience. Some might look down on the text for being just a nursery rhyme and not a more formal piece of writing. But Chen Hongmo argues that In the Words of Children uses the language of children for children. Using their language makes it naturally easier for young learners to learn, to understand and sing along, so it doesn't have to be formal. This concludes our introduction to In the Words of Children. Let's now turn to the text. In the Words of Children is found in Volume 1 of Becoming a Sage, and it starts on page 1. It starts with the 4 character phrases, where each phrase contains 4 Chinese characters. We will read the lines in English, which correspond to 1 column of text each time, and then we'll explain what it means. The slides will show both the Chinese text and their English translation, and we'll focus on reading the English. Now, the sentences may sound simple, but they actually encapsulate much deeper Confucian principles, which interestingly resonates with modern thought and other cultural traditions. So we very much look forward to exploring these links. Where necessary, I'll provide stories to illustrate the messages. In total, there are 3 one-hour talks on In the Words of Children. Let's take a look at the first line. Be composed in all that you say and do. Many mistakes result from haste. What sounds like a platitude about conducting oneself with composure, more haste, less speed, means much more in the Confucian tradition. One of the foundational texts in Confucianism, called the Doctrine of the Mean, tells us that it is the sage who exerts no effort and yet hits upon what is right, who apprehends without thinking, and who is naturally and easily in harmony with the Tao, or the way. Being composed in all words and actions describes the manner of the sage. How do sages achieve this ease? If we think of any skilled practitioner, be it the concert pianist, the veteran surgeon, or the gold medal athlete, what they do might seem effortless, but it has taken them years of training. Becoming a sage is no different. So what is the skill of the sage? It is the art of living. The Confucian tradition observed that our daily lives are made up of various routines and encounters, which are denoted by the Chinese term li, and often translated in English as ritual. To understand this idea of ritual, the American philosopher, Professor Herbert Vinger, points to a parallel in our contemporary culture. He refers to the ritual of a handshake. Let me paraphrase. I see a person I know on the street. I smile, walk up to them, put out my hand to shake theirs. And behold, without any effort on my part to make them do so, they spontaneously turn towards me, return my smile, raise their hand towards mine. We shake hands, not by pulling on each other's hands, but by spontaneous and perfect cooperative action. It happens so naturally that we don't even notice the subtleties of this coordinated ritual act. The handshake is coordinated and reciprocated because both parties know this greeting ritual. We've learned these rituals as we grow up, like when we're taught to say our pleases and thank yous. But there is more to it. For example, how to respond sensitively and appropriately when someone we know has suffered a death in their family, or when someone gets engaged or married. such occasions call for certain words and actions that are customarily expected. Knowing what to say and do means that we remain composed. But without knowing what to say and do, we may feel awkward, and we may even seem inconsiderate. Knowing how to respond sensitively and appropriately in different situations takes learning and practice. Have you ever wondered how some people always seem to know the right words to say and just know the thing to do? And they may seem to do it without any effort. It looks natural. In fact, Confucianism tells us that such interpersonal skills can be learnt, and everyone can become a sage. A sage in this context being someone who can say and do the appropriate things with calm and ease. In light of such benefits, traditional learning began as early as possible. First and foremost is the education within the family that's led by parents. In fact, education starts from the time when the baby is still in the mother's womb. Ancient Chinese texts, dating back to as early as the 2nd century before the Common Era, describe fetal development and provide instructions for the mother to follow at each stage of pregnancy. In fact, as early as the 12th century before the Common Era, history records that the celebrated matriarch of early China, Tai Rin, she paid particular attention to fetal education while she was pregnant. She gave birth to King Wen, who became one of the founding fathers of the longest dynasty in Imperial China, the Zhou dynasty, which lasted almost 800 years. Here, on the left is a portrait of King Wen, and on the right is an extract about Tai Rin. By nature, Tai Rin was devoted, reverent, and unfailingly virtuous in her conduct. When she was with child, her eyes beheld no evil sights, her ears heard no perverse sounds, and her mouth uttered no careless words. She was able to teach her child in the womb. At birth, King Wen was brilliant and sagacious. When Tai Rin instructed him from one of her precepts, he was able to understand 100 principles. In the end, he founded the Zhou dynastic lineage. Fetal learning was confirmed by Western developmental psychologists in the 1980s. Not only can fetuses hear their mother's voice, as well as other voices and ambient sounds, but they can also remember what they've heard. Professor Tony DeCasper's work shows that fetal experiences begin to shape perceptual and cognitive functioning before birth. His research prompted a cultural shift in the way that parents, other caregivers, and health and education practitioners, how they view the capacities of very young infants. It is now widely accepted that we begin learning before birth, and that the learning is carried into postnatal life across the birth divide. In other words, human cognitive development begins even before we're born. These findings corroborate what early Chinese medical texts explain, that a pregnant mother not only nurtures her baby's growing form, she also contributes to their learning. Just as plant seeds germinate unseen and start growing below the soil, the fetus starts learning from their mother's words and actions while still in her womb. But the Chinese texts didn't simply point to language acquisition and cognitive development. They particularly noted moral sensibilities. In other words, the character of the child and the adult they would become was already taking shape in the fetus. Whether the mother was consciously educating the child or not, the fetus was already learning. Tai Rin in early China was aware of this direct correlation. As we read, she was careful not to watch or observe inappropriate images, not to listen to inappropriate sounds, and not to speak inappropriate words. Because of her taking such care in educating the fetus, her child King Wen was particularly well behaved from a young age. So we can see that pregnant mothers would traditionally be very careful for the sake of their child's learning and development. They would try to maintain decorum and serenity and try to ensure that what they see, hear, think, say and do accords with virtue throughout the pregnancy. The Pure Land Buddhist master, Master Yin Guang, emphasized the importance of mothers. Master Yin Guang said that how a mother educates a child directly affects humanity's chances of global peace and harmony. After all, the mother is her child's first teacher, and first impressions last. To further understand how parents educated their children to develop their character, let me tell you about Mrs. Cheng, who was the mother of two Confucian masters, Cheng Hao, depicted on the left, and Cheng Yi on the right. They lived during the 11th century in what's known as the Song dynasty. The Cheng brothers were successful scholars, officials, writers, and they were among the pioneers of a new development in Confucianism, known as Neo-Confucianism, and that lasted until the end of imperial China. Their mother, Mrs. Cheng, knew the importance of education. First, she led by example in her own attitude and interactions with others. Mrs. Cheng was a kind and humble person. She interacted with others harmoniously. She kept the family home well organized, and she never mistreated the servants. In fact, if Mrs. Cheng ever caught her children berating the servants, she would remind them that people may have different social status in society, but we all share this earth as equals. Being wealthy and respected is no excuse to behave arrogantly towards others. So this gives us some idea of the person Mrs. Cheng was. How did she go about teaching her children? If her children misbehaved in a minor way, Mrs. Cheng would discipline them herself. But if it was more serious misbehavior, both Mr. and Mrs. Cheng would teach the child together to help them correct their habits. Mrs. Cheng believed that the main reason why some children turn out unruly and degenerate is because they've been spoiled. The parents spoil their children by ignoring or hiding their faults and wrongdoings. And this means that the child develops bad habits from an early age, and the behavior just gets worse as they grow older. Mrs. Cheng gave birth to 6 children, but only 2 survived. While some people might be inclined to spoil the 2 surviving children, Mrs. Cheng did not. When her children were learning how to walk and were still unsteady on their feet, she would not coddle her children by picking them up as soon as they stumbled. Instead, Mrs. Cheng would remind them by saying, "If you walked slower, you would have no reason to fall." And this is what the opening phrase of the text is about. Be composed in all that you say and do. If our every move is steady, calm, and composed, how would we fall over? Obviously, falling over is almost inevitable when we take our first steps, but it was never a cause for Mrs. Cheng to indulge her children. At the dinner table, she would seat her children next to her, and if they preferred to eat the tastier items or were fussy about their food, Mrs. Cheng would immediately stop them. She would say, "If you're so fussy about your food as a child, what will become of you as an adult?" When her children got into arguments with their friends, even if they were in the right, Mrs. Cheng would not take their side. She would say, "I'm more concerned that you cannot be accommodating of others." A person simply cannot expect everything to go their way or to win all of the time. It is poor form to be in the right and not try to be accommodating with others. So the Cheng brothers learned from a young age not to be fussy about things in their day-to-day life. They learned never to use abusive language. These examples give us a glimpse of how Mrs. Cheng raised her sons, and so it was clearly no accident that they went on to become 2 of the 6 literary masters of the northern Song dynasty. Here is a poster published by the state government of New South Wales in Australia. Did you know that 90% of the adult human brain develops before the age of 5? Like the stakes supporting the straight growth of a tree sapling, we can't overemphasize the importance of early childhood education. What we learn during our fetal period, infancy and childhood, influences how we think and behave ever after. Early habits of thought and behavior quickly become second nature. They crystallize our character and determine our destiny. Fetal education and family education are just the first phases of learning. Formal education was traditionally divided into elementary and advanced levels. The elementary stage, up to the age of 15, draws on the child's incredible powers of memory, when their brain is just like a sponge, and it is easier to establish procedural and long-term memories. In this stage, the child is given direct instructions. Just like a novice starting out, they may only know to follow the specific directions. If they're faced with a slightly novel or different situation, they may be unsure as to how to proceed. But by the time they've reached the advanced stage, they will have gradually developed a deeper understanding. They will know why and when they need to do certain things, so they can be more adaptable. The advanced stage makes use of reasoning, analysis, and abstract thinking so they can fully adapt the guidelines to different situations. So the application of this passage, be composed in all that you say and do, many mistakes result from haste, begins at the elementary stage, but its depth and application are extensive. Let's take a look at the next line. Calm in conduct, unhurried in speech. Don't act rashly, else be ridiculed and scolded. This passage sounds much like the first, but there is a subtle and significant difference. The opening passage merely talked about conducting oneself with composure to prevent personal mishaps. Many mistakes result from our haste. Here, this passage is still about being calm and considered, but it refers to our interpersonal interactions, like our unhurried speech, and not causing people to be upset by rash behaviour. The humanistic education of traditional China was much like that of ancient Greece. The goal of education was human excellence. As we mentioned before, education was geared towards nurturing the intellectual and moral virtues to lead a full, decent and dignified human life. This lies at the heart of Confucian philosophy. The UNESCO Chair in Humanistic Education, Professor Nimrod Aloni, explains this well. He wrote, in contrast to the shark, dolphin or any other animal, human beings are to a great extent the thinkers, scriptwriters, directors, actors and audience of the reality of their lives. Then it follows that they shoulder a great responsibility for the quality of this drama, which is their and our lives. A human is capable of anything and everything. Exemplary heights of wisdom, sensitivity, conscience, refinement and creativity, but who is also capable of descending into the heinous abysses of instinctual savagery, evil, ugliness, crudity and murderousness. One of the earliest writings in the Confucian canon, known as the Book of Changes, or in Chinese the I Ching, explains that human beings are equal in virtue to the heaven and earth. Each one of us has the ability to nurture life on this planet, as described by the Chinese saying, propping up the heaven and establishing the earth. This is not difficult to imagine when human activities can make such a difference to the environment and biodiversity. More importantly, it is our caring and our capacity to care that defines our humanity. And this is encapsulated in the Chinese term Li Shen, which appears in the Chinese text of this passage. Looking at the Chinese characters are interesting because different components come together to make meaning. And the ancient scripts, like the small seal scripts here, are more pictorial in the sense that we can recognize meaning through the shape of the character. On the left, the first Chinese character is pronounced as Li, and it takes the form of a person standing front on, with the line at the bottom representing whatever they're standing on. It could be the ground or a podium, etc. That line draws attention to the person being in the upstanding position. The character literally means to stand up, but it also denotes to set up or to establish. To the right is a second character, pronounced as Shen, and it depicts the body of a pregnant woman with an unmistakable baby bump. It means body or self. Our physical body is the means by which we express our caring, and whatever we do may have an impact now and or set an example for the future. But the self also embodies our character and the legacy of our parents and ancestors, like a link between the past and present. To establish one's character, in the Confucian sense, is about helping all beings do the same and realize their potential. In doing so, we live in honor of those before us and those to come. Now, how do we establish our character? We establish our character by committing to interact with others with humanity. For example, being motivated by benevolence and compassion rather than self-interest. Not doing unto others what one would not want for oneself. Interestingly, like the English words of human and humanity, the Chinese characters for human and humanity share the same written component and pronunciation. Let's take a look. This is the Chinese character for human or person. It's pronounced as Ren. From the small seal script, we can see that the character for human takes the form of a person standing side on in a respectful bowing position. It is as if our Chinese ancestors who formulated the characters were trying to tell us that being humble and respectful is part and parcel of being a good human being. Now, this is the character for human. If we look at the character for humanity, it's also pronounced as Ren, and from the small seal script we can see that it's a combination of two characters. On the left, it's made up of the Chinese character for human, and on the right is the Chinese character for the number 2, represented by 2 horizontal strokes. It's as if when we think of ourselves, we're reminded to think of others, be it the other person or party in a relationship, or people generally, say in the wider community. And it's interesting that the first Chinese dictionary, known as the Shuowen Jiezi, defines the Chinese character for humanity as a closeness with others, sort of loving others as oneself. Now, on the topic of applying humanity in our interactions with others as we cultivate our character, it's relevant to understand that Chinese philosophy groups interpersonal relationships into 5 categories. All relationships are simply variations of these basic 5, and they are the relationship between parent and child, between spouses, between senior and junior, between leader and subordinate, and between friends. The first 3 relationships occur within the family context. That's the relationship between parent and child, between spouses, and between senior and junior, like older and younger siblings. The other two relationships occur within the community, and that's the relationship between leader and subordinate and the relationship between friends. Of the three family relationships, the parent and child relationship comes first because our relationship with our parents is the first experience of interpersonal relations. If you think about it, during the formative years of infancy and childhood, we tend to interact most with our parents or primary caregivers at home. As such, our parents are able to influence how we subconsciously learn and relate to everyone and everything later in life. In this way, the parent-child relationship in the Confucian context forms the foundation for a person's interactions with others throughout life. And that is why humanity in our interpersonal relationships begins with our parents. Parents practice humanity by loving, caring, and educating their children. And children reciprocate this love and kindness through the attitude of filiality. Now, what do we mean by filiality? One time, Confucius' student Ziyou asked Confucius about filiality. Confucius replied, "Those who practice filiality nowadays only think of providing for their parents." Does filiality merely involve supporting or providing for parents? Confucius then explains that horses and dogs are capable of serving their masters. While dogs can keep guard of the house and horses can help with transport and farm chores, they do not know respectfulness. So respectfulness distinguishes the service of parents by filial children from the service of the master by horses and hounds. When another student, Zixia, also asked about filiality, to him Confucius replied, "The difficulty is with one's countenance." Now Confucius provided different answers, but they're really about the same thing. You see, a person's expressions are rooted in their thoughts. Keeping an amiable countenance no matter what is part of being loving and respectful to our parents. The same applies to keeping an even tone of voice and taking such care in our speech. Just as this passage states, "Calm in conduct, unhurried in speech." Showing love and respectfulness to our parents by our words and actions must stem from our heart. And this is part of family reverence or filiality. How children practice their humanity by reciprocating their parents' love and kindness. Humanity applies to all our various interpersonal relationships and is known by different terms accordingly. For example, when our love and respectfulness towards our parents is extended to the context of siblings, it's known as fraternity. In fact, the guidelines for learners, which you may know in Chinese as 弟子规, states that older siblings should love and care for the younger ones. Younger siblings should love and respect the older ones. Getting along well with one's siblings is a sign of respecting one's parents and caring that they are happy. So, loving and respecting our brothers and sisters is part and parcel of realizing our humanity. Confucius said, "A person of humanity is one who, wishing to establish oneself, helps others establish themselves, and wishing to gain perception, helps others gain perception." The human spirit is defined by its caring and kindness towards fellow beings. And this is what this passage is about, the training of which starts with our nearest and dearest. The next line is, "First, learn to be patient, don't be temperamental. Being rash and careless ruins all chance of success." This passage provides a starting point for our practice in Confucian learning. One of the fundamental texts in Confucian education, known as the Great Learning, tells us that Cultivating one's character, or self-cultivation, is essential for everyone, from the sovereign ruler, or the Son of Heaven, as the emperor was traditionally addressed, to the humble citizen. Now, why is it essential? It is through self-cultivation that we realize our humanity and our fullest potential. Such cultivation of character helps us recover the sage within. So how do we go about self-cultivation? Cultivation of our character doesn't happen when we just read a book. Cultivation happens when we try to live out the teachings in our every moment. Here, patience refers to the capacity to accept or tolerate everyday issues without becoming annoyed or anxious. For example, tolerating delays like traffic jams, slow web pages, and long queues, but also tolerating someone with a short temper. Temperamental describes someone who lets their emotions affect their decisions, which shouldn't be the case. Clearly, being patient and careful are the general keys to success. This was advocated by曾Guofan, a major intellectual and political figure of the 19th century.曾Guofan is celebrated as one of 4 distinguished statesmen in modern Chinese history. He was also a 70th generation of descendant of Zhengzi, one of Confucius's foremost students. His writings have been widely read since the late Qing period. According to曾Guofan, patience can be broken down into 3 aspects: patience with matters, patience with people, and patience with one's mind. First, patience with matters. This involves being diligent in keeping a firm resolve to see something through, not giving up no matter how hard it gets.曾Guofan said, "Accomplishing anything important requires both broad vision and meticulous attention." Broad vision in this context is more than thinking of the bigger picture. It involves a broadness of mind, being tolerant and forgiving in the face of challenges. Even with this generous spirit in overlooking someone's mistakes, one must be able to focus on the fine details to ensure optimal quality of work and management. With these attributes of broad vision and meticulous attention, one must persevere until the goal is completed. And this is patience with matters. Second, patience with people. This is about being understanding and accommodating. There's a Chinese saying, "Be strict and disciplined with oneself, be understanding and considerate of others." With the Qing dynasty being the last imperial dynasty in China,曾Guofan had to navigate a complex bureaucracy. His strategy towards the politically cunning and manipulative can be summarized in one word: sincerity. He writes that being sincere in our interactions moves others to abide in virtue and reciprocate with genuineness. They will naturally feel ashamed. That's patience with people. Finally, patience with one's mind. This is about keeping calm and collected.曾Guofan said, "The hero is tempered when they're exhausted in mind and thought." It's those times when you've thought of every possible scenario in your head, or you're physically exhausted and you don't even have the energy to think anymore. That's when your inner convictions are tested, so we must remain patient.曾Guofan had to do his job as a public official in times that were politically challenging, so he was tested in how he dealt with difficult circumstances while serving the public interest. So patience is key. Patience with matters, patience with people, and patience with one's mind. Our patience, adherence to the principles, is tested particularly in times of difficulty, whether that be with challenging matters or with difficult people. Confucius reiterated this when he said, "The exemplary person never departs from humanity. even within the space of a single meal. In times of confusion and distress, they hold fast to it. In times of danger, they hold fast to it. The exemplary person represents the first level of attainment on the path to becoming a sage. Even at this first level, the exemplary person will remain in tune with their humanity. You may have heard of Mencius, the Chinese philosopher who lived in the 4th century, about 100 years after Confucius, and Mencius was also instrumental to the Confucian tradition. Mencius said, "Humanity is the human mind," meaning humanity is innate. Rightness is the human path. To quit the path and not follow it, to abandon this mind and not know enough to seek it, is indeed lamentable. If a man has chickens and dogs that are lost, he knows enough to look for them. But when he has lost his mind, he does not know enough to seek it. The way of learning is none other than this, to seek for the lost mind. The lost mind is not a psychiatric disorder, but a loss of one's humanity. Patience is not simply enduring until difficulties subside. Patience involves making the most of each situation. How do we do that? Confucian learning equips us with the tools of thinking and adaptation. In any given situation, we have a choice, to let go of our humanity or keep a firm hold of it. We can choose to be temperamental or to try to think in another person's shoes. We have a choice whether to be resentful or to forgive and move on. This is why the text states, "First, learn to be patient. Don't be temperamental. Being rash and careless ruins all chance of success." Let's take a look at the next line. Knowing a little and showing off. A large bell keeps silent, a full bottle makes no noise. There are some good analogies here. Have you ever noticed that a bottle that is half full will make noises when it's shaken or moved about, but a full bottle is soundless? We know that a bell might be large, but it doesn't toll without being struck. The largest bell in the famous Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, France, is named Emmanuel. It weighs 13 tons and is the oldest and largest among the bells in the cathedral bell tower. Emmanuel is traditionally rung only for historic occasions, major religious celebrations, visits from the Pope, and presidential funerals. For example, it was rung at the end of the First and Second World Wars. Like the great bell, the cultivated person speaks only at the appropriate time. This is illustrated in an account about the 3 sons of the famous Chinese calligrapher Wang Xizhi of the 4th century, what's known as the Eastern Qing dynasty. Here, Wang Xizhi is depicted on the left. At one time, Wang's 3 sons went together to visit a prominent statesman called Xie An, who is depicted on the right. The 2 older sons talked continuously about trivial matters, but the youngest son only remarked about the weather and nothing more. After the 3 brothers left, the guests who remained asked Xie An, "Of the 3 who were here just now, which one is the best?" Xie An replied, "The youngest is the most excellent." A guest asked, "How do you know?" Xie An replied, "The words of fortunate men are few, those of excitable men many. It was by inference from this that I knew." The tendency to babble and chatter away was considered a symptom of an unsettled mind. If you think about it, a person who is calm and settled will act according to ritual. They will speak only at the appropriate times and express themselves in appropriate ways, so they will naturally make fewer mistakes and enjoy better fortune. That's why Xie An said that the words of fortunate men are few, whereas the words of the excitable are many. there is another interesting story recorded in the Chinese writings. Once there was a man who came from a place called Chuqiu. He came into possession of an antique that resembled the shape of a horse. The antique had the head and neck of a horse, along with the back end and tail of a horse, but strangely there was a cavity in the horse's back. The man had never seen such a thing before, so he asked around to try to find out what it could be used for. A person from a place called Wei heard about this antique and came to inspect it. After taking a look, the person from Wei said, "In the past, there was a type of wine vessel in the shape of a rhinoceros, and another type in the shape of an elephant. What you have here is a wine vessel in the shape of a horse." The owner of the antique was delighted to hear this, and he would use this antique whenever he had guests over for good meals. One day he had a visitor over from Mount Chou, and the person from Wei also happened to be present. When the visitor from Mount Chou saw the wine being poured into the antique, he was shocked. He said, "Where did you get that thing from?" "It is a urinal. It is a type of urinal used by the noble ladies in the past. How can you use it to hold wine?" This story brings to mind Confucius's advice to his student Tzu Lu. He said, "When you know, to know you know. When you don't know, to know you don't know. That's what knowing is." The reality is that the more we know, the more we realize that there is so much out there that we have yet to know. There is so much to learn, and it is easy to forget that we might only be thinking of one part of the bigger picture. For example, when we finish primary school, we might feel like we've mastered everything at school. Then we start secondary school, and we're the ones being mentored by the senior students. Year 12 is a graduation milestone, only to start university as one of the freshers. Then if you ever do a PhD, you'll realize that you barely know anything at all. Start learning another language and it's back to the numbers, 1, 2, 3, all over again. So we can see the wisdom of knowing the limits to what we know and being careful and considered in what we say. That's why this passage reminds us, knowing a little and showing off. A large bell keeps silent, a full bottle makes no noise. This brings us to the end of this talk. Your comments and feedback are always much appreciated. Thank you very much indeed.